She is the founder and clinical director of the Child and Family Counseling Center in Brentwood, Tennessee, which consists of a variety of mental health professionals providing therapeutic services across the lifespan. She is the current president of the Tennessee Psychological Association and past president of the Nashville Area Psychological Association. So a big woman, and we appreciate her being here to talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and happy Friday. So today I'm going to talk about how good clinicians do harm and what we might do about it, including ethical and cultural considerations. This presentation really started as a conversation amongst colleagues about the subtle things we do in therapy, or we hear stories about in therapy where, you know, it's the harm that clients express sometimes in session. And this was originally a 3-hour presentation and ran till the end. So it's been a labor of a lot of work, really, to cut it to an hour. It's a topic I'm really passionate about. So I'm going to probably ask that most questions and comments, because I think conversation about this is really important, are held to the end. But if it's something that really isn't making sense or a point that can't wait, it's absolutely okay to ask along the way. Oh, my slides aren't progressing. That's not good. There we go. So they've already introduced. Before we get started on this topic, you know, the topic is about how good clinicians do harm. And sometimes that's the hardest thing to admit. We spend a lot of time talking about big harms in therapy, and hopefully most of us haven't experienced that. So I really want to encourage people today to shift into a growth mindset. Approach this conversation and this presentation with some open-mindedness and curiosity, not just about others in the field, but about yourself. And give yourself a grace and a kindness. You know, if we talk about something and it hits with you and you're like, oh, did I do that? That's okay. It happens. Like, how do you do better next time? So, you know, embracing discomfort, being a little vulnerable. If at some point you don't feel a little uncomfortable, I really feel like I didn't do my job today. So, I mean, I'm kind of here to dysregulate you a little bit and make you stop and ask those hard questions, and take a non-judgmental stance, because, you know, mistakes are how we grow and do better. So to keep the mood a little light, we'll start with Never Have I Ever Therapist Edition. You can just keep a tally. It's fine. So which of these have you come across? Never have I ever had a client tell me something concerning about a previous therapy experience. So these may be the clients who have seen people before you, and they come in and they tell you stories about their experience in therapy, or how they were dismissed, or feelings they were left with. And you're like, say what now? You know, what do you do about that? So that's hopefully something we can talk about a little today. Never have I ever unintentionally created an alliance rupture with a client. You know, when have you been sitting in the therapy room and, you know, you're like, oof, that didn't hit right. Or maybe it's not till way later. You know, they cancel the next week and you're like thinking back and you're like, ooh, that was not good. What are we going to do here? Never have I ever let my personal or political values influence my work. So we all know we're not supposed to. It's been a rough couple years, y'all. There are a lot of feelings in the world, a lot of feelings. And I think it might be a little impossible for those not to creep into the room sometimes. Never have I ever taken on a client I knew I shouldn't have, for whatever reason. Maybe they begged you, or one of your friends, your good therapist friends, is like, will you please see this client? And they're telling you about it. And you're like, no, okay. Maybe it was convenient, or maybe, you know, you had a financial need or an hours need. Trainees in particular can run into this slippery slope. Never have I ever seen clients during a personal problem when I should have taken time off. So if you're working in some kind of organizational setting and you have paid time off, it's a little easier, and your PTO is still limited, and people are going to ask why you were gone so long. If you're in private practice, you don't have PTO, so bad things happen. How long are you allowed to take off before you come back to work? And when is it an ethical decision and when is it a financial decision? Never have I ever dismissed a client without ensuring I provided appropriate, and I want to emphasize, and available referrals. I'm sure none of you have experienced the current mental health crisis we in, and all of you know people with availability at the moment. There are times where it is ethical and appropriate and necessary to refer clients out. How are we doing that process is something we'll address today. Never have I ever created a plan in case of inability to provide service due to illness, death, or disability. This is not a topic most of us like to approach, and it's really embedded into a lot of our ethics that we should have that plan, a professional will, colleagues, backup, support, something. You need something in place. Never have I ever had to report an ethical violation to the board. So this is one that I think I hear less about actually happening, right? So we hear a lot in our more typical ethics seminars, you know, don't sleep with clients. And if somebody sleeps with a client, like, we're reporting it to the board. But, you know, that does happen. It is the most common ethical violation that gets reported. And that's not the stuff we're talking about today, but we will at the end talk about, you know, when and if, you know, do we need to consider that? I'm a psychologist. I'm most familiar with the APA Code of Ethics. LPCs have ethics, LMFTs, licensed pastoral counselors, social workers. They're all a little different. If you haven't read everyone else's ethics codes, I highly recommend you do. They all provide something a little unique. Some are more specific than others about certain things. APA has some aspirations about social justice. They recently updated their ethics that you follow law over ethics unless it's a human rights violation. So that's a new caveat they added. The social worker code of ethics, I read 2020, I think is when I read that for the first time. And it really highlighted like the role of social justice in their ethics code very clearly. And those are things that are more aspirational in some ethics codes and more direct in others. So, you know, I recommend reading them all and reread yours. Read it often, and don't just read the rules, read the aspirations that are included, because there's a lot of really good information there. Sections that focus on things like competence, dual relationships, advertising, even confidentiality, those all address areas that could have potential to create harm to a client. So I'm going to trust that everyone will read their ethics codes. I'm not going to get into the details about them because I want to make sure we can spend time talking about treatment harm today. What does that look like? I think this quote is really important just to like sit on for a little bit. We must especially work to discourage yielding to the desperate need to do something by acquiescing to the compulsion to use anything. So a lot of us, maybe not all of us, and we all have our own things, use empirically based treatments a lot of times. And I'm sure we've all had the client where it's just not working. And have you ever had the feeling, and you don't have to answer out loud, but you can, have you ever had the feeling that you're like, I'm just throwing darts now. I'm blindfolded and the lights are off and I'm just throwing darts at this point, hoping something works. That's a good time sometimes to stop and go, why? Why am I doing what I'm doing? How am I making these choices? Have I stopped and consulted with another professional? And am I seeing if someone does something that I don't do that could be more helpful to this client? And am I running the risk of harming this client and making them feel broken or too much or not fixable because I don't know what I'm doing in this moment? So in regards to treatment harm, we do a lot of research on treatment effectiveness. That's how we came up with our empirically supported or empirically based treatments. That's our alphabet soup. What's efficacious for a lot of different conditions. So ACT, CBT, DBT, EFT, IPT, I could go on and probably include almost all the letters of the alphabet by the time I listed all the empirically supported treatments for all the different things. What's interesting about the research on empirically supported treatments is that research is often focused on treatment adherence. So was the clinician adherent to the treatment? Was the clinician competent to provide it? And then they look at the big numbers. Did the treatment help? Well, dissemination, where we go from research to practice, I think we've all probably experienced a little of like, it doesn't quite work the way you said it was going to work. because those distinctions become less meaningful. This is a real question. What's the number one predictor of treatment success? Therapeutic alliance, over and over and over again. So we love our empirically supported treatments, whichever one we do. We're like, that's my baby and it works. But that's not the predictor that comes out over and over and over again. It's therapeutic alliance. So what is the quality of the work you're doing? What's the quality of the care you're giving? And that importance of that therapeutic rapport really, really matters. And that's the place where when we get too focused on the what we're doing and not focused enough on the how we're doing, that we may end up doing more harm than we do good. So it would be really nice to know what a potentially harmful treatment is. Potentially harmful treatments, so they've tried to create some criteria around these. What are they? What would they look like? So in research, they're trying to come up with what would the criteria be. So treatments that demonstrate harmful psychological or physical effects in clients or others. I think that's a really important caveat too. We are often in a room with a person. That person lives in a system. And yes, sometimes if you're doing couples therapy, for example, the goal may not be to stay together. They may come in with a goal and you're like, you could stay together or you could grow apart. We're going to see what's best for you, right? But we need to be paying attention, like the things that we're giving this person, how is it impacting the system? So if symptoms get worse, that's a thing to pay attention to. And yes, there's a little, if you look at number 2, the harmful effects are enduring, not merely a short term. I do behavioral interventions with parents and kids sometimes. We have a lot of talks. This is going to look worse before it gets better. They are going to test your limits, see if you're sincere about this, if you're going to follow through. But what if it just gets worse? And what if we keep going, it's just a little longer, you have to be more consistent, or just keep trying? At what point are we not being helpful anymore and potentially even being harmful? The development of new symptoms is something we really want to watch for. Excessive dependency on the therapist. There are clients who will use you as their like comfortable object. Anxiety is a big one where you can see that happen. Personality disorders, you can see it show up. But how do you work on making sure along the way? So some people will encourage you to talk about termination in session 1, right? Is termination your goal? What does that look like? How would you know you don't need me anymore? When do you do check-ins? When do you follow up on progress updates? When do you say, hey, like, do you still need to come every week? Reluctance to seek future therapy. If the work you do results in someone not being willing to get the help they need in the future, that's harmful. And it's important to pay attention to. I work now more with adolescents and older adults, but when I was younger in my career, my clients were also younger. And working with young kids, I'd often have a conversation with the parents with kids coming with anxiety or depression. And that conversation would often go along the lines of, the best thing I can do for your child right now is make this a good experience. Because if they have this kind of anxiety presenting now, even if we get better, there's a chance they'll have it presenting again. Because if you have it once, you're more likely to have it twice. If you have it twice, you're more likely to have it a third time, and on it goes for a lot of our disorders and diagnoses. So making sure that clients' experience is recognized and validated, and ideally positive, even if it's hard. So positive doesn't mean good all the time. Physical harm. A lot of you may be like, what? You'll see on the next slide. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the whole rebirthing therapy that resulted in the client passing away and those things. There are treatments out there that will cause physical harm. Harm to relatives and friends, client dropout. So those are all things to watch for. And again, we talked about number 2, but number 3, in a research setting, they're trying to find out, have these harmful effects been replicated? Are different people finding that things are harmful? So when they look at that, what comes out? You know, first of all, it's notable, we do publish a list of empirically based treatments, but we don't have readily accessible list of potentially harmful therapies. When I first started putting this presentation together, it's actually really hard to find the literature and the research and follow the trail. And even that literature, if you read it, they're going to say, it's really hard because there are statistical errors in X's data or Y's data or whoever's, or we don't have the numbers we need to really make these decisions. So there are some that research does tend to show that are not helpful: conversion therapy, rebirthing, scared straight, and even critical incident stress debriefing has a tendency to show that trying to process it in the moment of the trauma can actually cause more harm than good. Where this becomes hard, and I will say it's a valid hard, is that unsupported therapies may not be harmful, they're just new, and we don't have research on them yet, and later they're proven to be safe and effective. So we want to be mindful not to call out everything as harmful too quickly or too fast. So things like EMDR and ACT, once upon a time, were seen as a little like, what are they doing? That's not real. And now we know that they're actually really good treatments for a lot of different presenting issues. Francis Martin is actually a local who wrote a book called Therapy Thieves. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with him. He does some really great trainings on supervision. But his book, Therapy Thieves, really has a whole chapter that digs into all the different kinds of therapies in the world. So I want to say it was like 2,200 websites they explored. And on those websites, they went and identified treatment approaches from these practitioners. And I think they were a little fascinated and maybe horrified, I don't want to speak for someone else, at how many different kinds of treatments are out there. And does that have potential to hurt the field? And does it have potential to hurt clients and confuse clients so they don't know what they're seeking? On a positive, there was a consensus on a lot of websites around the empirically based treatments. That's just a small example of them with CBT, family systems, solution focused. But there were also a lot of advertised approaches that were more concerning. Because this is a shorter presentation, I don't have time to show you all the things, but in the book, these lists, I mean, they're long. There's tons and tons and tons of them. And you're just like, what? People advertise what? And if you are someone who has things on your website and you're like, it's okay, it's just a thing, we're all learning, no judgment. But they found a large number of solo approaches. So on websites, they'd see somebody advertising a therapy approach that wasn't advertised anywhere else. Ideology-driven approaches, a lot of suffusion of religion and therapy. So I know at least in Tennessee, we have licensed pastoral counselors, right? They're trained in using religion as part of their therapy work. But I will often see requests for a Christian counselor. Are you a Christian counselor if you are Christian and you do counseling? So I think understanding that dynamic and that difference, what are you advertising? And are you advertising something you actually do? Or are you advertising your identity as a method of practice? Unusual approaches were identified, just 3 examples that I pulled out: fairy tale model therapy, after-death communications, eco-spiritual therapy. I have not seen the literature on any of those. If you have them, happy to look at it. And the other big thing they found are people who advertise activities as therapy. So if I take a client for a walk, is that walking therapy? Or am I doing CBT while walking? Or am I doing mindfulness while walking? So just sort of being more thoughtful about, like, if you're saying I do this therapy, is it a therapy or is it an activity? And then what approach are you really incorporating into your practice? They did take the list and they were like, of all these things, some are just, we're putting activities out or we're putting ideologies out, but what's really inappropriate? So they went through and had a panel of 10 people review these, and they would mark it inappropriate if they felt it was ethically questionable, lacked clinical relevance, was like a personal expression, or unknowable and made up. And when they went through the list, there were 40 treatments that were deemed inappropriate by 10 out of 10 reviewers, and another 27. So you had 67 treatments deemed. I'm sorry, what? I think it's that big number, but I think that like, I don't think they marked things like hiking therapy as necessarily inappropriate. It's just, is that the best label for the field? Does it help our field or hurt our field if clients are being marketed hiking therapy as an effective treatment? So this is a short list that I pulled just from alphabetical order of these inappropriate treatments. So you can read through, and these are the names that they used on the website. Now you might read through and you might see some like, well, chiropractic care can really help some people, you know, especially if they're dealing with chronic pain. And I'm like, you're right, it can. So what's that? I think my favorite, I went out of order because I felt like people needed to see that there were people who were marketing time travel. If you were doing that and you're good at it, please let me know how. And whatever works, right? And that may be someone who's just throwing it out, like, I will do whatever works for you. And if, you know, maybe that's okay. And, you know, what are you actually doing to help the client? So when we talk about these other things, it's, you know, considering the ethics of complementary alternative medicine. So there are plenty of therapists who are certified yoga people. They have a name. I'm blanking on it. But there are therapists who also do yoga. They are certified in it. But is yoga the therapy, or is yoga a complement to your therapy? And I think these are the questions to ask when you're advertising and marketing, and even recommending. So even if you're not doing it personally. So how would you know when it's maybe okay to do these things or when it's not? So some guidelines that have been put out would be, first of all, to consult your scope of practice laws. If it's something that requires a secondary license or something beyond a certification, make sure you have it. Is it evidence-based, or do you have like some grounded reason or rationale for recommending this other thing? Or have you tried all the evidence-based things and that's why you're going this direction? Are you competent to provide it, or are you making a referral to a competent provider? Are you maintaining the dignity and welfare of the client? And if it is something you're doing in your office, do you have appropriate informed consent practices? And that's really important. Like, what does your informed consent say about this? If you're doing all of this under your therapy informed consent, does your client really, are they really giving you informed consent to do these other things? So Sue and Sue is a pretty seminal paper, at least in the psychology field. I'm not sure beyond that. But in regards to potentially harmful treatments and multicultural counseling, I do think it's really important to consider these views. But counseling and psychotherapy have done great harm to culturally diverse groups by invalidating their life experience, by defining their cultural values or differences as deviant and pathological, by denying them culturally appropriate care, and by imposing values of a dominant culture upon them. I think as a field, we all like to think we're getting better. And, you know, you can't know what you don't know. So some considerations in this, first of all, is that harm is a social construct. So you might look at a client and go, I didn't harm you. No, I did my job. I did the treatment. I did what I was supposed to do. But if that client is saying, I felt harmed, then maybe harm was done. And maybe we need to take a step back and say, why do you feel harmed? Help me understand. How can I help you better? Or what do you need? And that requires a lot of vulnerability as a clinician to say harm is your perception. It is not on my end. Now, sometimes we can look and we can go, yes, that's harmful. Or sometimes we can look at a client and be like, they are good, we're good, it's not harmful. Other times we need to listen to the person who is expressing harm. You know, psychotherapy can be inherently ethnocentric. There's a long history in the field of critical misdiagnosis and over pathologizing minority populations. And while we over pathologize, we also have a tendency to assign briefer, less intensive, and lower quality interventions. The other thing to be aware of is what are the misattunements and micro ruptures that can happen between clinicians and clients. So sometimes the rupture is obvious when the client looks at you and says, you only care because I pay you. Okay, So we're not having a great day today. Let's talk about that. And sometimes it's smaller. Sometimes it's they turn away. Sometimes they skip a week before they come back. You know, sometimes there's just a little subtle jab, a little resistance. So paying attention to those can be really important as well, because there's a lot of things that can cause those. And one of those things is microaggressions. Microaggressions for some people are really tricky to talk about, because it's just really easy to go, well, I'm not biased. I'm not racist. I'm not homophobic. Yet when your 15-year-old male client came into the office, did you say generically, hey, you dating? Or did you say, hey, do you have a girlfriend? What if that 15-year-old male client in your office is gay? That's your bias. It showed up in the room. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't meant to cause harm, and it could have. But those little microaggressions can invalidate or trivialize minority experiences, and their perception matters. So being more mindful of your work, recognizing when you may have said something or stepped in something in a way that could have been harmful to the client, taking ownership of that. Because when these harms happen in a therapy experience, they lower therapeutic alliance. And what's the number one predictor of therapy success? Therapeutic alliance. Clients have lower treatment satisfaction. We talked, one of the things that could be like a defining factor of harm is the resistance to go back to treatment, and it can result in worse outcomes for the clients. So when we talk about empirically supported or empirically based treatments, you know, who's most research completed on?
College students.
College students. How many of you see that is your population, just college students? So we're using these treatments, right? And they're empirically supported, but are they? So the APA anyways said, let's do some guidelines. So what is evidence-based psychological practice? So let's go beyond the ESTs. What are the other things we need to consider? So one stool is the best available research. So it'd be nice to have diverse research on diverse populations and know everything we can possibly know, and we don't. So we take the best available research. We also take patient characteristics, culture, and preferences. So if you're not in a great habit yet of saying, what do you want out of therapy? What's your expectation? What would you like to do? If you're not in a great habit of stopping and checking in and going, how are you feeling about this process? And if they use the F word, stop them. Fine is my least favorite word in therapy. Like, it's fine. Well, what does that mean to you? Because most of my clients who walk in the door and I'm like, how are you? And like, I'm fine. I'm like, so it's been a bad week. And they're like, yes, how'd you know? Because you used the F word. Don't use the F word. So, you know, I think they are trying to say, they're trying to get us to a place where culture, diversity, background, lived experience is part of our judgment and decision-making process in how we are going to treat the clients who come into our room. The third leg of this stool is clinical expertise. And that's where we're headed next. And I get that this feels fast. It's a lot I love to talk about. And these are discussions. So I'm putting a lot of information out. You will have the slides available. I hope that you find a group and a network, whether you have one already established or you create one. And this makes you talk about these issues. This makes you think about these issues. Happy to respond to emails, join conversations. It really is a passion area of mine in the past several years. Well, let's talk about that clinical experience. Therapist competence. It's rough, y'all. Get your mirrors out. It's a rough world out there. Ooh, that's the wrong button. So there is some research. And number one is we tend to look again at therapist competence as, do you know the treatment strategies and procedures, and can you do them? That is a very small piece of what kind of competence actually helps in the therapy relationship. Still know your empirically based treatments, or at least some of them. That's good. And do you know when your treatment is indicated? And even more importantly, do you know when it's not? Do you know when a treatment might actually be like a bad solution for a problem? So I've gotten certified in biofeedback. Biofeedback, really good for anxiety. It can be really bad for OCD. Hey, I want you to make some waves on the screen. Why don't you make them even for me? Maybe don't. So know when it's helpful and know when it's not. Can and should your therapy approach be combined with others, including medicine? When are approaches, when do they work together and when don't they? If you're doing adherent DBT, how many other things could or should you be doing at the same time? What if I'm doing some mindfulness and cognitive behavior therapy? This is why we created mindfulness-based cognitive behavior therapy. We just create new treatments to do whatever we want to do, really, which is our empirically based treatments, empirically based. What is the typical treatment response and what are the adverse effects? Do you know what you should be seeing? Do you know at what point in your treatment a client should be improving? Do you know how much improvement you should be seeing based on the research? And then are you talking to that client? Are you identifying ruptures? Are you knowing when they're stuck? What are the commonly encountered difficulties that arise in your treatment and how do you address them? So if people come in and it looks like a good CBT case, I'm like, CBT, if we're doing it by the book, 16, 20 sessions, give or take 4, just kind of depends. That's if nothing's going to complicate it. Guess what usually happens in clinical practice? Something complicates it. How many of you have just seen depression and nothing else in a client? Just very simple depression. Maybe here and there, it's not your normal, just seen anxiety. There's a lot of dual diagnosis, and that's another thing that research often excludes is complicating factors. So is it representative of the clients we actually work with? So knowing how to talk about your treatments. If you're making really great progress and you're doing well, maybe I shift you to maintenance a lot faster than treatment says I should. If you're really struggling and there's a crisis of the week and we're not getting anywhere, I may need to talk to you and say, hey, we need to extend treatment, or maybe we need to abandon what we're trying because it doesn't work. Maybe we need to shift sets and try something different. And maybe that's with me if I'm competent to do something else. Maybe that's with someone else who does something I don't do and they do it really well. Knowing what not to do is sometimes even more important than knowing what to do. So just being mindful of that as well. And in particular, what are things that interfere with a therapeutic relationship? Those are going to be some of your big no's. And what are things that can undermine treatment? Part of competence is cultural competence. These are by no means an exhaustive list of all the potential problem areas, and I get they are very generic. Again, used to be a 3-hour conversation, started as like a whole night of talking with colleagues and just going on and on. But know that we all have biases. If you think you never bring a bias into the room, start talking to somebody. We all bring a bias into the room. Microaggressions. If you think you've never had one, chances are you're probably wrong. They're microaggressions for a reason. They are a result of our bias. That's just brain. Like we have brains. Brains are biased. Brains are lazy. I mean, they work really hard and they love stereotypes. They love their scripts. They love their schemas. They want to make as snap judgments as they can because that's how they're wired. That snap judgment, that microaggression that happened, that doesn't inherently make you a bad person. If you have an unwillingness to stop and check it, and then to rectify it if you've done something that could have been harmful to a client, that's when it becomes a true problem. Ignoring cultural elements altogether. What is this client's background? What are their religion? Those things are important in how we approach treatment. And again, I love my empirically based treatments. Are they really? How empirical are they? And that data is biased too. So yes, it's science, and yes, it's data, and yes, it's biased. So if you are a clinician who loves their one thing, challenge yourself to grow your box, challenge yourself to expand, and challenge yourself to get a community of clinicians around you and really great referral sources. So if your one thing isn't working, there are plenty of other options on the table. And then the important considerations around cultural competence, and again, by no means an exhaustive list, but two, I want to highlight because I don't think I hear them highlighted enough. One, a lot of minority populations already have existing biases to treatment. There's something in their culture that says you aren't supposed to do that. So if you have someone who gets past that bias, shows up in your office, and something about that interaction turns them off to therapy, how much harder is it going to be for that person to ever seek help again? That is the kind of harm that doesn't get talked about enough. And then if you're talking even just like, I mean, Tennessee, like we're in the city, that's great. I think we all still realize it's pretty underserved and better served than a lot of our rural areas. So when you're in an area where those people have low resources or low access to care, if the community mental health center is literally their only option, what happens when harm's caused there? They don't have the luxury of shopping around for care. They don't have a lot of options available to them. And I think this really gets deep into our training pipeline because a lot of people, not all, there's some very good souls out there, but a lot of people in those settings are very young clinicians. They are clinicians who don't have the lived experience to inherently avoid some of this as easily as people who are more experienced. And I think one of the most concerning results in the literature is that we all like to think, I am so experienced, I have gotten so much better. And the research would say that's not true. There are a small group of clinicians that get better with time, but in aggregate, it's a relatively flat line. There's not a lot of change. And on the whole, it's non-significant, thankfully, but on the whole, there's actually a trend of decrease in effectiveness over time. And is that about complacency? Like why? Why do we not get better? So, growing your community, good consultation, ideas that don't match and align with yours always. How do we constantly educate, improve, and grow and not believe that what we know is the best we can know? So when do you check for competence? 3 main points: at the time of referral, during the diagnostic interview, and as you're going along, if new issues or diagnoses become evident throughout treatment. Those are my favorite. I'm just anxious 3 months later. Did I mention I don't eat? Ever. Great. That is not the same thing we've been treating. So when you are sitting here going, I don't know if I'm competent. Number one, I hope I've said consultation a lot. I'm going to keep saying it. Get supervision or consultation. Talk to your community. If you have any questions or concerns, can I do this? Can I not do this? What should I do? What am I doing? Because there's a couple possible outcomes. And sometimes our gut reaction is if I'm not competent, it's going to be like, they got to go. But that has a huge risk of harm to clients that we'll talk about a little more, because you can actually choose to continue. Again, every situation is unique, but if you have appropriate supervision consultation and you can get the education and training and you are openly communicating to your client, hey, this is not my wheelhouse. This other stuff we worked on, this is my wheelhouse. This is not. So we have some options here. So don't let a client think that you're a master in something you're not. Ending therapy and making referrals in a therapeutic manner. If a client shows up one day and you're like, I can't, like that psychosis episode looking thing you had, that's not I can't, got to see somebody else. Here's a list, bye. That is harmful. That is more harmful than following up with that person until they can get better care in almost all cases. I'll use almost all, but help them call around. That may be your session time. Your session time may be problem solving. Who can we call? Who's available? What do we do? Hey, I don't know how to help you with this, and I want to make sure you're okay. So what's our plan until we can get what you need? And in both of these, really considering the potential harm of the options. And the two things that stood out in research with clients report, continuing without additional support and client abandonment were the biggest causes of harms that clients reported in some of these studies. So be very mindful of your endings. Endings matter. Do talk to your client. You may refer out all or some of the care. A lot of us are like, you can't work with me if you're working with somebody else. If that someone else is doing something very specific and niche, and you have a very solid relationship with that client that is healthy and important, let that niche person do their work and communicate and collaborate and say like, hey, how often do you think it's healthy for me to keep seeing them or to touch base or check in? Hey, I think the plan is for them to go back to me. And if that is, I always talk to the client. I'm like, and if you like that person better and they're helping you, you can also go to them. I won't be offended. I want you to have the best care you can have. Trying to give them at least 3 names with specific information if you need to refer out, and obtaining the release of information for whoever they're going to is ideal. And the research does tend to say that competence and reputation is often more important than a specific theoretical orientation. So know your community. There's a lot of new faces for me in here today. I'm excited. I hope I get to meet, I've met some of you. I hope I get to meet others. But knowing who's in your community that does good work, that other clinicians admire and respect, like that matters. Because what's the #1 predictor of treatment success? Therapeutic alliance. Caution about abandonment, adapt to special circumstances, rural communities, underserved communities. You're the only therapist they can find available that they can afford. Be flexible to some degree. And then, if you don't have a group you're in or consultation or mentorship or support, make sure you're building that into your clinical practice. Perhaps it's time to attend to the responding of each and every individual to avoid bearing potentially important negative effects in the group average of clinical trials, whether those negative effects are due to unrelated life events, untoward therapeutic influences, or the direct effect of a given psychological treatment. We have all heard the medication commercials. Side effect like A to death. We don't do that with our therapy as much or as well. What happened to all the people who dropped out? What happened to all the people who didn't get better? It all gets buried in the aggregate of the data. I love me some CBT and it's not great for everybody. DBT skills are awesome. The whole program's awesome and it's not great for everybody. What works for your client, and are you being in alignment with them? Are you talking to them? Are you figuring out what they need? Because that's the human in the room with you. And I think that's one of the biggest failures between research and clinical practice is important differences get lost. And I don't know how to click without turning that on. So summarizing the more subtle forms of harm, unmet client expectations, unhelpful therapist behavior. There's a whole list of that. It's all the competency things. But endings, competence and endings are the 2 really big ones to take away and think about. Ruptured alliances. What are the things that caused it? How do you fix it? And then the wrong therapy process. Even if your therapy process is empirically supported and it's the right therapy process, there are times where it will be the wrong therapy process. And it's okay to know that. It's actually really important to know that. Oh no, I think I caused harm. So what do? Take care of yourself. We make mistakes. We're just like our clients, we're human. Sometimes it's even helpful to be like, what would I tell my client to do right now? Take care of yourself, take care of your client. You really have to, with taking care of your client, if it's a current client and there's a rupture to fix it. But if it's a former client and you're thinking back like that, maybe don't reach out, maybe reach out, get some consultation, talk. We could talk through 1,000 scenarios and there'd be 1,000 different answers of what's potentially the best way to approach that. But just take care of you, take care of your client. And when I think about areas to grow, and some of this is in the research and some of this is from my personal experience of having clients come to me after seeing other clinicians, Some of the ways I've seen harm caused in the community is, and it's often younger, but not always, but when clinicians don't have some of these top skills, when they haven't quite been trained to tolerate high levels of client distress, they don't know how to really lean into those difficult situations. They hear them and they're more like, okay, somebody else has to do that. If they don't have quality training in how to manage suicidal ideation and non-suicidal self-injury, if your first response is to be like, okay, you got to like sign this agreement and go to the hospital, one or the other, there's so many more options in between that are more effective for a lot of clients. And I think sometimes one of the things that gets in the way is we live in a society where we do as a whole sometimes let liability fears dictate best practice. None of us want to get that call from the ethics board or the call from the lawyer and be like, okay, I guess you need to go to the hospital because just in case. Just in case is not sound clinical judgment, y'all. It's not sound clinical judgment. So be confident in your skills and know what you don't know. If that client isn't committing to safety, send them to the hospital, totally. It's okay to know what you don't know. Consultation, consultation, consultation. I'll just subliminally say it until everyone has good consultation. Good notes, and this doesn't just mean your therapy notes, which I'm sure we're all up to date on. This is if you have a hard case or you're uncertain, why did you make the decision you made? Document it somewhere, write it down. And sometimes even when you write it out, you're like, why did I make that decision? But why did you make the decision you made? And compassion for yourself, your clients, your colleagues. And if a client says they were harmed by another clinician, it's really important to validate that's their perception, that's their lived experience, that's their truth. Even if it's a clinician you know and adore in the community, like don't get into it's just their thing. How might this affect your work with me that this happened to you? How can I make sure we don't go back there again? Be mindful of how and when to challenge the perceptions. If it becomes clear that it's part of the disorder, maybe there's a point where it needs to come back up. Maybe it doesn't. Again, 1,000 conversations would result in 1,000 different results. Consult with people. Client confidentiality is really important to consider though, because if it's a clear ethical violation, ideally you want to empower the client to do something about it because it's their confidentiality. If you get permission from the client or you empower them to do it, our ethics, most of them say, talk to your colleague first. I'm guessing a lot of us, if it came down to it and we were like, hey, so I heard, like most of us don't want to make that phone call to a colleague because we know there's two sides to every story. That may not be the truth. It's just their version. But if it's clear ethical violation, we do need to figure out the best way to manage it while maintaining client confidentiality. And again, we're not going to have a ton of time for conversation, but I think it's a really good conversation to say, it's not ethical, but it's concerning. Like, are they really doing this with clients? What do you do? Do you confront it? Do you not? What does that look like? If you decide or you have permission or you feel like it would be helpful to, and I think this is something we lack. I don't know that we communicate well about our failures as much as we like to pat each other on the back. If you're giving feedback though, number one, respect client confidentiality. This is not about you feeling good. This is about your clients not being harmed. Be respectful of the clinician. That's another professional you're talking to. Even if you have a bias now based on what you heard, you only have some of the information. You only have a piece of the story. You don't know it all. And what is your purpose? Really think about, why am I having this conversation? Is it informative? Is it corrective? What is my goal? And then if you are on the receiving end, if you ever do get one of those calls, so, hey, how you doing? Do you suck that bad? Don't say it that way, but like if you get that call, our instinct in situations like that is to run or defend, right? It's just a natural instinct, but try to drop that defensiveness and be open to the feedback. You heard what? I'm a business owner. I have like 10 or 11 other clinicians that work under me. If people are not giving good feedback about my clinicians or myself or my client, like I want to know. I can't fix a problem I don't know exists. And it would be really hard for me to get that feedback. And I want it. So I have to be willing to receive it. And I can receive it and I can question it while also validating, like, wow, that was their experience. wow, I hate that they felt that way, or I had no idea. And I don't know how I did that. So I need to figure something out. And it's just an opportunity to grow. So when you make a mistake, there's 3 things you should do: admit it, learn from it, and don't repeat it. And that's all I got. So there's a little bit of time for questions, comments, conversation. Thank you so much. Any questions or just comments or conversation points? Yes.
I was curious, and this may be a bit outside the scope of what you've prepared, but if you have some thoughts on just over the last couple of years, you referenced current mental health crisis.
Yes.
I'm wondering if there's anything that comes to mind that's a bit more specific to this particular moment that we're in, that around client harm, unintentional client harm.
Yes, politics are a hot topic these days. I work with teenagers. Teenagers have lots of opinions. And, aligning with clients, if you agree with them, to an extent could be healthy, right? But if they're expressing like, oh, my uncle and he's, but if uncle's an active part of his life and parents aren't going to let him avoid uncle, if you're only validating that experience and not challenging, like, well, you can disagree with him, and how can I teach you to function in this environment you're in? You're probably over aligning and doing more harm than good. If a client comes in and they have very different values and they're like, I voted for, and you're like, great. It's not so great to be like, why would you do that? And and these are things I think most of us know, but depending on the day and what news story you just read and what shows up in the atmosphere, there's a lot of things. So, I think a lot of the hot topics, the mental health crisis, COVID, and then we managed to make that political somehow. Do you require a mask in your office? Do you not? Why do I have to wear a mask? Why aren't they wearing a mask? Why do you not require a mask anymore? How do you have those conversations with the people who come in, and how do you make sure you're keeping it like, how can you best be comfortable, or what can I do to help you? So, all of it really. And, it's unhealthy to push your values onto a client. I think we talk about that a lot. It can also be unhealthy to over align, especially if that over alignment prevents you from doing your job and teaching them how to function as best they can in the world that they live in right now. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I'm thinking other thoughts, but it's helpful as a good thing that I'm not going to.
Yeah. Yes.
So the experience of having a client who has had a clearly unethical experience with a therapist in the past, but who absolutely refuses to have any kind of permission for me to either address that therapist or, if necessary, go to the board.
So if a client has had a clearly unethical experience, but they don't want to have any release of confidentiality to like talk about that, at that point, I think number one, you respect the confidentiality, because that is, I think, one of our biggest ethics, right? I do think consulting in general, is there a way to talk to that clinician without addressing that specific client, or would it be super obvious? I think people love it when we call ethics boards with like hypotheticals. Hypothetically, if I know TPA has a ethics committee, and they get calls like that sometimes. I don't know about all the other boards. But I think, again, consultation, asking questions, we can get a lot of information and ask a lot without ever identifying the client, but be mindful too, right? So it's identification. If it can go beyond a name, right? So I could, even without using a name, if I give you too much information, you're going to know who that is. But I would say respecting the client confidentiality and not causing more harm, unless it's something that is clearly like, so we are all mandated reporters. And I think sometimes, with teens, they tell me things and I'm like, oh, it's going to be more harmful to report this than not. And I have to report it because that's bound by law. I think those areas get more gray. And that's why having consultation and taking notes on your decision-making process. So if it comes back up later, but I also think that working with the client potentially at times, you don't have to push it, but talking to the client about empowering them. Do you understand that that was not an okay experience? Do you understand that you could do something about it? And I can't guarantee an outcome. It could go absolutely nowhere and you could still have your voice. That's an option too. But what does the client need?
Kind of related to the therapist competence, I'm curious if you've dug much into like the deliberate practice, feedback informed treatment stuff, and if so, what your take on that is.
I personally haven't dug into that a lot yet. It's one of those things as I get older, I'm like, I want to know all the things. And I'm like, I can only know so many things at one time. The little I do know though, like, I think that's where I default currently to like having good circles. And I do think in session, getting better feedback, one thing our office has started to do, we're still working on implementing it. So consistency is always fun, but we are working on trying to at least draft notes at the end of session with clients to be like, so what I heard you say, or the main things I got today were, what about you? And I found that that's actually really interesting as long as I've done this. So in some ways, I do think that system of getting feedback from clients is good. I did do a section on, that in an ideal world, clinicians would all be measuring symptom profiles and outcome measures. In reality, do we have the time, energy, and support staff and finances to do that? Probably not. So there's different ways, but I think it is helpful because otherwise we're making assumptions. And if the client keeps coming back, we're like, we're great. But if the client's been coming back for 3 years, like how great are we, depending on the treatment goal? Yes. What is it? I don't know if I know how to find it on this anymore. Stop sharing this and.
Yes,
Okay, you can, yes. If you're muted.
Not for the first time. Thank you. I think your presentation was really awesome.
Well,
I
thank
loved
you.
it. And I needed it and I loved it. And the thing about over-aligning with clients was very helpful to me also. Since mid-March of 2020, I have been doing purely teletherapy, and I've gone to a number of different seminars on that and stuff, but I would like to hear your input on what's different about teletherapy versus what potential harms do we have to address in teletherapy versus in person.
Yeah. So potential harms of teletherapy versus in person is an interesting question. And I think, and if you need to step away, that's fine. I think there's definitely like the big things of, is it an appropriate teletherapy case? Now that we're coming out of COVID, I know the TPA professional director of affairs is putting together, like Tennessee has a new telehealth law. I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but it describes like you have to go through a decision-making process for telehealth. Like, is it appropriate? Because there are certain things that telehealth isn't great for, crisis stuff, chronic suicidality, those sorts of things it's not necessarily as good for. But, in the spirit of this presentation, I think sometimes the more subtle harms are, how present are you with your client? How present is your client with you? How are you paying attention to what's happening in the room or on the screen? I work with teenagers. Their screens go black a lot. And it's an opportunity to have a conversation. Or, my attention span's not great. I'm designed to be an in-person human. I'm just built that way. And I'll find myself twitching because, if I forget to pull it into a separate tab and I see a new email pop up and I'm like, don't read that. But even just seeing it pop up, it's pulled me away from being present in the moment. So, I think it's a lot of that interpersonal relationship and just making sure that you are being in tune with that client still and not pulling away, whether on purpose or accidentally, is a really big thing. So,
Thank you.
yeah, any final comments or questions? One final thing I will just throw out, because I think it's a good perspective. When I did this talk, the longer version at the TPA convention, one of our past presidents, it was a very insightful comment, right? And it goes back to our field and where it has failed historically, right? He's like, when I was training, being gay was a mental health disorder, right? So I think it's important to realize and give grace to the fact that our field is changing and our field has caused harm and it has done damage. And some of that damage lingers in the community. So as we grow, just grow, do better, be better, not because you're bad. And that's the whole point. It's not how bad clinicians harm. We talk about that too much. How do good clinicians harm and what do we do about it? So I'll leave you with that just to think on too. Thank you so much.